The request for inspection came without warning, delivered in the clipped, impersonal tone of someone who had never seen a battlefield and assumed armor was just another piece of equipment to be evaluated. She stood at attention in the center of the lecture hall, a lone human among rows of alien cadets who whispered behind their mandibles, frills, and respirator masks, mocking the weight of her plating, the dents, the carbon scoring that no polish could hide. They thought it was sloppy maintenance. They thought humans wore armor like costumes. None of them knew the truth. None of them had ever been close enough to war to feel its teeth. When the instructor gestured impatiently toward her chest plate, she didn't argue. She didn't stall. Humans didn't stall. She simply unsealed the magnetic locks with a sound that echoed through the tiered hall, a hard metallic crack that made 3 cadets flinch before they caught themselves. The plating fell into her arms with a heaviness that felt more like memory than metal, and as she lowered it to the floor, the room began to go very still. Her undersuit clung to her frame, but the blackened, rigid fabric couldn't hide the jagged burns carved across her ribs, burns that cut like lightning strikes, burns that looked almost alive under the harsh white overhead lights. She hadn't moved yet. She hadn't spoken. She simply let them see. And the silence that followed wasn't the respectful kind. It was the stunned, frightened kind. The recognition kind. Because several of the species in that room had seen scorched patterns like those before, but never on someone still breathing. A Yevran cadet in the 3rd row inhaled sharply, his gills shuddering. Another lowered her eyes, ashamed, as if she already knew what came next. The instructor opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat as she reached to unclip her shoulder guards as well, exposing the raised, branching scars that wrapped around her upper arm like a twisted map. Flames had done this. Starfire grade. Invasion class. Weapons meant for cities, not soldiers. And when she finally raised her head, her eyes were not proud or dramatic or triumphant. They were tired. Old. The kind of old no teenager should ever be. "You requested inspection," she said, her voice steady in a way that made several cadets straighten instinctively, as if responding to command presence. "This is the condition of my gear." And this, she lifted her arms slightly, letting the scar tissue catch the light, "is the condition of its wearer." Her words landed like falling steel. No one dared interrupt. Even the instructor's eyes flicked toward the scorched patterns, tracing their spiraled arcs with widening discomfort. They all recognized the signature now. Humans weren't the only ones who remembered that war. The Empire called it the cleansing campaign, a disgusting euphemism. The humans called it what it was, an invasion. She shouldn't have been alive. No one hit with a plasma destabilizer at that distance should have been alive. The cadets knew that. And yet she stood there, breathing evenly, posture unbroken. She didn't explain how she survived. She didn't explain why she still wore armor patched in the same places the burns sat on her skin. She didn't have to. Every species in the hall carried cultural ghosts, the things their elders whispered about humans when they thought none stood nearby. Humans didn't die easily. Humans fought past the point of sense. Humans survived things that should erase a body. It was myth to some, horror story to others. But seeing her now, bare-scarred and absolutely real, forced all those whispered stories into the light. A cadet finally broke the silence. A young Carthan, shaking despite the steady clicking of his exoskeletal joints. "That pattern, that weapon signature. That was from..." He stopped, but she didn't. She turned her gaze toward him, not accusatory but coldly factual. "Your people's forward assault fleet," she finished for him. "Wave 3. Northern Hemisphere breach. Hive code designation Emberfall." The Carthan's shoulders sagged with shame. His species had apologized in the decades since. Diplomatic letters. Public memorials. Cultural reforms. But apologies were rituals, and rituals were easy. Living with the consequences was not. A few aliens looked away entirely, guilt and discomfort simmering in the air like static. Others stared at her with something else, respect, maybe, or fear, or the unsettling realization that they had been laughing at a survivor of their own side's atrocities. She could feel their stares, but she didn't react. She just continued removing the rest of the plating piece by piece until she stood in nothing but the thin, scorched undersuit designed to cling to wounds and distribute heat away from flashed burns. Burn scars mapped her torso-like continents, some old and faded, others newer and still angry. Her left side held the worst of it, the place where the firestorm weapon had hit her during the collapse of Bastion Ridge. She finally set the last piece of armor beside the pile and lifted her chin. "If this inspection was meant to evaluate my readiness," she said, "consider it demonstrated." There was no arrogance in her tone. Just truth. Measured. Precise. She wasn't performing strength. She was stating fact. The instructor swallowed hard and tried to regain composure. "Cadet, you should have disclosed prior injuries of this magnitude." "I did," she replied quietly. "3 times. Your system flagged the records as classified conflict trauma." "Not my classification. Yours." The implication hit him harder than any accusation ever could. The Academy had wanted humans, but not their histories. They wanted the strength, the ferocity, the reputation, but sanitized. Neat. Palatable. Not this. Not the raw, burned reality of what human survival actually looked like. Another cadet, a tall silver-scaled Mirith, finally broke the heavy tension. Why did you come here? To an academy full of species who fought against your people?" It wasn't mockery. It was genuine confusion. Pain, even. She took a slow breath, the kind that stretched the scar tissue across her ribs in pale, jagged lines. "Because humans don't avoid the table where war was decided," she said. "We sit at it. And we make sure it never happens again." Her gaze swept across the room, not accusatory but unwavering. "I'm here because someone has to be." And that was the moment the room changed, not with applause or fanfare, but with the quiet, powerful shift that happens when truth sinks its claws into people who cannot look away. That was the moment sympathy replaced ridicule. The moment myths became flesh. The moment every cadet in that room, no matter their species, realized something they had been trained to ignore. They were standing in the presence of a survivor who had endured what their empires once built entire campaigns around. She didn't move to reassemble her armor yet. She didn't feel the need. They had demanded inspection. She had given them the truth. And in the silence that followed, the truth weighed more than any plating she had ever worn. The instructor dismissed the class early, but no one moved. Not at first. They sat frozen in their seats, the air thick with the shame no syllabus had prepared them for. She knelt quietly beside her armor, picking up each piece with careful precision, her movements methodical, not rushed, not shaken. She handled every scorched plate like a memory she had already made peace with. The cadets watched in an uneasy silence, each one wrestling with the same realization. They had mocked her armor, mocked its dents and burn marks, without ever considering the human inside it. And now that the truth stood in front of them, burned into her skin, their earlier whispers tasted bitter. The Mirith cadet, the tall silver-scaled one, was the first to rise. His species had fought alongside the Carthan during the invasion, but he had always kept a polite distance from her, as though proximity alone risked dredging up old ghosts. Now he walked toward her slowly, hands visible, movements respectful. "Cadet," he said softly, "if you need help reassembling." "I don't," she replied, not harshly but simply. It wasn't pride. It was habit. Humans rebuilt their armor the way some species recited prayers, personally, intimately, with full ownership of every scar and weld. But she did offer him a nod, a small gesture of acknowledgement that the Mirith took as permission to kneel beside her anyway, even if he dared not touch a single piece. The others followed in hesitant waves. A few stepped down from higher rows, some keeping distance, some drawing closer, all of them wearing the same haunted expression, the dawning awareness that they had been blind. That they had believed the neat, sanitized version of history their governments had fed them. That they had entered the academy thinking humans were just dramatic fighters who liked to embellish their war stories. She didn't speak while they gathered. She simply continued assembling her armor, piece by piece, letting them feel the weight of their own silence. It was the Carthan cadet, the one who had recognized the weapon's signature, who finally broke. He approached with stiff, trembling precision, mandibles quivering in shame. "Cadet," his voice cracked. My family served in Wave 3. I wasn't born yet. But my lineage, my name." He swallowed hard, the clicking in his throat barely audible. "It was my people who brought that fire to your world." She stopped tightening a magnetic fastener. Not angrily. Not dramatically. She just paused, then looked up at him with a calm that struck him harder than any accusation ever could. "You didn't hold the weapon," she said gently. "And I didn't light the stars that burned your outposts later in the war." She let the words settle. "We inherit scars. Not guilt." The Carthan's breath caught. A concept so simple, yet one no one had ever spoken to him. He bowed his head deeply, both hands pressed over his chest in a gesture of respect, and backed away without another word. The instructor, who had been hovering near the exit with a pale, uncomfortable expression plastered across his face, finally cleared his throat. "Cadet, human cadet, I apologize for the manner of the inspection. I was unaware of the extent of your injuries." She tightened the chest plate with a sharp metallic snap. "Most are unaware," she replied, voice even. "Humans don't request accommodations. We train like everyone else." Then she added, with a quiet edge that made the instructor's eyes flicker downward, "Pain is not a disqualification." A few cadets exchanged uneasy glances. Some species considered physical injury a reason for retirement. Others wore their scars as decorations. But humans treated survival like a skill. A form of excellence. A burden they carried without complaint. That realization unsettled them more than the burns ever had. It was then, as she rose to her feet, armor reassembled, posture steady, that an unexpected sound echoed through the hall, a soft chime. The classroom holodeck had activated on its own. A moment later, a notification flashed across its surface, projected in pale blue light. "Archival record access requested. Human historical files, Emberfall incident." Every cadet turned startled. She didn't. She knew what it was. She had expected this. The moment they saw her scars, several someones, would want to know more. The galaxy was full of species who preferred curated histories, stories edited to protect reputation and legacy. But humans had open libraries. Their pain was documented in full clarity, not hidden beneath political gloss. The Mirith cadet stepped toward the console, scales shimmering uneasily. "The Academy system is requesting access," he said quietly. "Someone wants to view the original footage of the Emberfall breach." Several cadets stiffened. They had heard of Emberfall, but only the edited version. The one where human resistance was called irrational. The one where civilian casualties were listed as regrettable but necessary. The one where firestorms were classified as urban clearing devices. Human archives did not use those words. She walked slowly to the console, every step measured, each footfall echoing across the silent hall. When she reached the table, the hologram scanned her biometrics automatically. Human files required human authorization, and flashed green. "Access granted?" The cadets leaned in. The instructor said nothing. Because for the first time, they were about to see her side of the war. Not propaganda. Not legend. Not whispers. The truth, raw, unfiltered, unedited, was about to unfold before them. She lifted her chin, eyes steady as she spoke. "Very well," she said, voice low but resolute. "If you want to understand the armor, then you'll need to see what created it." A few cadets inhaled sharply. She placed her hand on the console. "And what created me?" The holodeck flickered once, then stabilized, projecting a shimmering field of light that expanded into a full panoramic recording. The moment the first frame sharpened into focus, several cadets recoiled. It wasn't a battlefield. Not yet. It was worse, a city street. Ordinary. Peaceful. Children's chalk drawings on the pavement. Market stalls with half-folded awnings. A sky as blue as polished crystal. And in the far distance, almost invisible at first, embers rising like dust motes. "That's Emberfall," she said quietly. "Before the breach." A hush swept over the room. Every cadet leaned closer, as if afraid to miss a single detail. Aliens born in war empires were used to seeing other planets suffering as abstract diagrams in textbooks. Casualty maps. Strategic summaries. Cold, emotionally sterile data. But humans recorded everything. Remember everything. The footage jumped forward. A tremor rippled through the camera lens. A siren began to wail, a long, rising note that made every species present instinctively stiffen. Then the sky split open. At first it looked like a sunrise. Blinding. Beautiful. Then the flames poured downward like liquid glass. "That was the first wave," she said. "Thermal destabilizer bombardment. Non-targeted. Civilian zones first." The cadets stared, horrified, as the firestorm washed over the horizon. Buildings disintegrated in sheets of light. The air shimmered with lethal heat. Shockwaves pummeled the ground so hard that the image distorted with every impact. A pair of humans sprinted across the street, one dragging a child, before a collapsing blast consumed them in an instant. No scream. No struggle. Just annihilation. One cadet whispered, "Why attack civilians first?" "To break morale," she replied. "To send a message. The same message they tried to send to every species they conquered." Her gaze hardened. "But they miscalculated with us." The footage jumped again. The camera operator was running now, breath ragged, panting as smoke and ash swirled around the lens like a living storm. The ground was cracked and glowing. A figure stumbled into view, her younger armor half melted, dragging two wounded survivors toward a makeshift shelter carved into the rubble. A collective gasp swept the room. "You were just a child," the Mirith cadet whispered, voice trembling. 16, she corrected. "Old enough to fight. Old enough to lose." On screen, the younger version of her shoved the survivors into the shelter and turned back toward the inferno, gripping a fire-damaged rifle that looked seconds from falling apart. She wasn't fast. She wasn't fearless. She was terrified. It showed plainly in her eyes. But she kept moving forward anyway. That was the part that shook the cadets the most. Not the death. Not the destruction. The refusal to stop. The footage shifted to the moment that would scar her forever. A blast shook the street. A fresh wave of destabilizer fire rained down, carving molten streaks through the stone. She was running, barely, when a shockwave hit her from behind. She screamed as a wall of plasma tore across her side, flinging her into a collapsed building. The camera tumbled, image fracturing into streaks of light and shadow. When it righted again, she was on the ground, armor glowing, undersuit melting into her skin, flesh blistering instantly. Her younger self clawed at the dirt, dragging her scorched body into a narrow crevice while the firestorm roared past. Several cadets looked away, unable to watch. But the Carthan cadet didn't. He watched every second, jaw clenched, mandibles trembling, because his species had been the ones who dropped that fire. The room was silent except for the crackling of the holographic flames. "You survived that, without medics?" someone finally breathed. "There were no medics," she said. "Just who you could carry. And I couldn't carry myself." The footage jumped again. Hours had passed. Night had fallen. Smoke still drifted in thick pillars across the ruins. Rescue teams, ragged, burned, barely armed, were pulling survivors from rubble. Her younger self sat propped against a collapsed barrier, body shaking violently, vision blurred, but still clutching a damaged rifle like it was a lifeline. She wasn't conscious. But her hands refused to let go. The instructor swallowed hard, voice cracking. "Why were you still holding a weapon?" "Because no one knew if the enemy would return," she said. "We reflexively prepare. Even half dead." The room felt colder now. Heavier. as if the hollow projection itself pulled oxygen out of the air. The video ended abruptly. No music. No narration. No dramatic flourish. Just darkness, and the quiet hum of the projector shutting itself down. She stepped back from the table. For a long moment, no one spoke. Not even the instructor. These cadets had memorized battle tactics, fleet maneuvers, casualty statistics. But none of them had ever felt, truly felt, what war meant to a species that had been burned, scarred, nearly erased. Then, one by one, they rose. Not in fear. Not in pity. But in respect. The Carthan cadet approached her first, head bowed so low his mandibles nearly touched his chest. "Cadet," he said quietly, voice trembling. "Your survival, your endurance, it is not myth." He swallowed. "It is truth. And it is heavier than any of us understood." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached down, touched the clasp of her chest plate, and tightened it until it clicked shut. "War changes everyone," she said softly. "But it doesn't have to define us." The cadets straightened at that, not because she asked them to, but because something about her words demanded it. A kind of gravity. A center of mass forged in fire. And then, as the last echoes of the projection faded, the instructor spoke the words no one expected. "Cadet, would you be willing to teach the next lesson?" Her eyes widened slightly. Not in pride. Not in ego. But in something far deeper. The instructor's question hung in the air like a suspended breath. She didn't answer right away, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood the weight of what he was really asking. He wasn't just offering her the floor. He was acknowledging, publicly, formally, that experience carries authority. That scars earned in fire can teach what textbooks never will. That her presence here wasn't a footnote to history, but a perspective the Academy had failed to include. She stepped forward with slow, deliberate calm, boots echoing lightly against the metallic floor as the cadets parted instinctively to give her space. Not out of fear, fear had left the room entirely, but out of respect so profound it felt ceremonial. When she reached the center of the hall, she tapped the console. The hologram reactivated, but she didn't pull up archived footage this time. Instead, she opened a blank field of light, an empty grid waiting for her voice to fill it. "You've all studied invasions," she began, her tone level and controlled. "You've memorized troop movements, fleet formations, casualty bands. But metrics don't teach you what matters." She let the hologram flicker behind her, a vast canvas of untouched space. "War isn't lines on a map. War is what happens in the spaces between those lines." A few cadets leaned forward, breath caught. The instructor said nothing. He had shifted into the role of student without even noticing. She raised one hand, and the hologram responded instantly, lines bending, shaping into a simplified map of Bastion Ridge. But instead of marking battalions or artillery, she traced paths the way humans remembered them, routes civilians ran, places where firestorms fell, spots where improvised shelters had saved dozens. She didn't lecture. She narrated, each word landing with the precision of someone who had learned these truths at a cost measured in skin and smoke. "What most species misunderstand about humans," she said, "is that we don't fight harder because we enjoy conflict." She glanced around the room, eyes steady. "We fight harder because conflict comes for us whether we want it or not." The Mirith cadet's frills tightened, not in fear, but in realization. "But more than that," she continued, "you misunderstand something else." She turned to the hologram, tapping a glowing point. The image zoomed in on a collapsed building, then another, then another. "You assume humans value victory above everything." She shook her head slowly. "We don't." A pulse of confusion rippled through the room. "We value survival." She tapped the hologram again. It zoomed in further, showing interconnected routes through rubble. Paths designed not for offense or defense, but for extracting survivors under fire. "When everything burns," she said softly, "saving even one person becomes a kind of victory." Silence. Not the oppressive, guilty silence from earlier, this one felt different. Heavy but alive. Curious. Open. She stepped back from the hologram and clasped her hands behind her spine like a senior officer, though she was still only a cadet by rank. You've all trained for hypothetical wars, she said. Simulations. Controlled environments. Her voice carried a fierce clarity now. But true war isn't controlled. It's chaos. It's smoke so thick you can't tell friend from enemy. It's screams drowned out by explosions. It's watching the world you knew vanish in seconds, and choosing consciously to move anyway. The Carthan cadet swallowed hard, mandibles tense. And you want us to choose the same? To endure as your species does? No, she replied. Endurance like ours is born from necessity, not desire. She let that sink in before she added. What I want, what humanity wants, is for you to learn enough from us that you never have to become like us. The instructor inhaled sharply, startled by the clarity of her message. The cadets exchanged uneasy, thoughtful glances. She wasn't glorifying humans. She wasn't making them mythic. She was explaining them. A young Draelith cadet finally raised a trembling hand. Cadet, in your world's darkest moment, what kept humans fighting? She looked at him, and for the first time since removing her armor, a faint softness entered her voice. Because someone had to survive to tell the story. That stunned them more than any footage could. She continued. If no one remembers what happened, it can happen again. Entire species can disappear because others forget the cost of conflict. So humans fight for memory. Not for vengeance. Not for pride. She paused. For remembrance. A ripple of realization spread through the hall. They had grown up thinking humans fought like berserkers, unpredictable, emotional, reckless. But the truth was far more unsettling. Humans fought because forgetting was worse than dying. The hologram dimmed as she stepped back, the light fading slowly behind her silhouette. The instructor cleared his throat, voice unsteady. I think, he said quietly, we all learn more in this hour than in any course the Academy has ever offered. She nodded toward the seats. Class dismissed. But no one moved. They didn't stand. They didn't gather their things. They simply remained where they were, staring at her the way soldiers stare at the one person who walked through fire and came back with the truth. And as she turned to leave, her armor creaking softly, a sound rose behind her. Not applause. Not cheers. Something far more meaningful. Every cadet in the room placed their dominant hand, claw, tendril, palm, or forelimb, over their heart. A universal sign of respect. A gesture reserved for survivors of wars too terrible to speak of. She paused at the doorway, just for a breath, then walked on. The corridors outside the lecture hall were quiet, almost unnaturally so. Word of what happened inside hadn't spread yet, but the silence felt expectant, as if the Academy itself sensed the shift that had taken place. She walked with steady, deliberate steps, armor still warm from the touch of her hands as she reassembled it. Every piece felt heavier than usual, not with burden, but with purpose. For the first time since arriving at this academy, this institution that had once represented everything humanity feared and distrusted, she didn't feel alone. Behind her, the door slid open. Footsteps followed. Soft ones. Then heavier ones. Then the uneven clicking of an exoskeletal gate. She stopped only when she realized she could hear multiple rhythms aligning into a single pattern. Cadets who didn't want her to walk out of that hall without them. The Mirith cadet approached first, lowering his tall frame respectfully. Cadet, he said, voice quiet but certain. The class, we want to request something. His frills fluttered with nervousness. Permission to train with you. Not as an assignment. Not as a requirement. His silver eyes hardened with conviction. But because we want to learn what you know. Not about war, about surviving it. She blinked, surprised. The Carthan stepped forward next, mandibles set with iron resolve. Your scars, he said, voice rough. They aren't marks of weakness. They're lessons. Warnings. And, if you will allow it, we want to understand them. So we can ensure our generation never repeats what ours once did. The group behind him murmured in agreement. Different species, different histories, all gathered under a single purpose. None of them looked at her with pity. None with fear. Only with a fierce determination she had seen before, unbattered human faces illuminated by firelight, clutching weapons they barely knew how to use but wielded anyway. She didn't answer right away. The academy corridor lights flickered faintly as she looked each cadet in the eye. "Training with me won't be easy," she finally said. "Humans prepare for the worst because the worst is what we've lived through. We understand," the mirror said. "No," she corrected softly. "You don't. Not yet. But wanting to understand, that's how it starts." A quiet breath passed between them, an unspoken pact, forming organically, naturally, the way camaraderie is born on battlefields without ever needing words. The instructor arrived seconds later, looking rattled from the weight of everything he had witnessed. But instead of trying to reassert control, he bowed his head to her, an act that left the gathered cadets stunned. "Cadet," he said, "today you taught what our academy has failed to teach for decades. If you're willing, I propose we design a new curriculum." His gaze softened, losing all authority and replacing it with something she had never seen from him before: humility. Built around your experience. Built around truth. For the first time in hours, she felt something shift inside her, something quiet, fragile, but deeply real. Hope. Not the hopeful ignorance of those who had never faced war. Not the fragile hope of survivors clinging to memories. But a mature, grounded hope, the kind that grows in the cracks left behind after everything burns. "We'll build it together," she said, voice steady. "But it won't be a curriculum about humanity. It will be a curriculum about every species that suffered in that war. Every world that burned. Every survivor who rebuilt. No more one-sided histories." The instructor nodded, eyes stinging. "Agreed." As he stepped back, the cadets gathered around her, not crowding, not overwhelming, but forming a quiet escort, as though guarding something precious. And in a strange, unexpected way, she let them. Not because she needed protection, but because they needed to offer it. They walked with her across the academy campus, past towering spires and training grounds bathed in cool artificial light. Cadets in other corridors paused, whispering, watching the formation pass. Some straightened. Some saluted. Others simply stared, sensing change but not yet understanding it. By the time she reached the courtyard overlook, the sun was beginning to rise, an orange glow brushing the horizon like the first warm breath after a long night. She paused, lifting her chin toward the dawn, letting the light touch the armor that still bore the blackened scars of a war she survived but never forgot. The Mirith cadet stepped beside her. "Human, may I ask one more thing?" She nodded once. "You said humans fight so someone can remember." He hesitated. "So, what do you want us to remember?" She didn't turn to him. She kept her eyes on the sunrise, her voice low, soft, but unbreakably clear. "I want you to remember that survival isn't a species trait," she said. "It's a choice. One you make every time you protect someone who can't protect themselves. Every time you choose truth over convenience. Every time you stand with someone who used to be your enemy." She exhaled slowly, watching the sun crest the horizon. "And I want you to remember," she added, "that the last invasion didn't end because humans fought harder. It ended because, eventually, someone chose to stop fighting." A deep silence followed. Peaceful. Meaningful. Then, almost instinctively, the cadets around her placed their hands over their hearts again. Different shapes, different textures, but the same gesture. A sign that they understood. A sign that they accepted. A sign that they were ready to learn. She let the moment settle, then turned to them with a small, rare smile. "Now," she said, "let's get to training." A perfect sunrise behind her. A group of former enemies now willing to learn. An academy changed forever. And a survivor walking forward, not alone, not anymore, but with a purpose the galaxy would feel for generations.